All right, everybody, let's get started. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the October edition of RTS Jackson's online discussion forum. I'm your host, CL Pierce, the Director of Admissions here in Jackson, Mississippi. As always, Dr. Ligon Duncan, Jackson Campus President, CEO, and Chancellor of Reformed Theological Seminary, is here to lead our discussion. Before I introduce our contributor today, a new podcast called The Everyday Pastor was just announced. Dr. Duncan, if you would please tell us more about it.
My friend Matt Smethurst, who is the pastor of the River City Baptist Church in Richmond, Virginia, reached out to me a number of months ago and he said, "Hey, I'd like to do a podcast to encourage pastors. I'm a younger pastor. I'm a church planner and a pastor, and I've only been doing it for 3 years. He's got other pastoral experience, but this is his first church and church plant. And basically, he said, CL, that he wanted me to be the old guy. So I'm the old guy. He's the young guy. I'm the Presbyterian. He's the Baptist. I'm the older generation. He's the new generation. And we're just talking about stuff that pastors have to address all the time. And we're inviting in special guests to talk with us and such. And that will launch next week. I think it's the 21st. They will put out the first podcast, and you can get it on wherever you listen to your podcast. So you can go to Spotify, or you can go to Apple, or wherever it is that you listen to podcasts. And it's just called The Everyday Pastor. And Matt and I will sometimes we'll just talk to one another about pastoral things, preaching, praying, visiting, just the normal things you do in pastoral ministry.
Pastor stuff.
Sometimes we'll interview people, and talk with them. So RTS professors and other people like that. So thanks for mentioning that. And TGC gave me my mic so that I could do the podcast from here in Jackson.
That's great. Well, we're thankful that the online discussion forum can receive benefit from that gift. So thanks, TGC. Okay, so I want to introduce Dr. Miles Van Pelt. He's no stranger to the online discussion forum. He's our professor of Old Testament and the director of the Summer Institute for Biblical Languages here at RTS Jackson. Miles, thank you so much again for taking time out of your day and to help us learn about the book of Hosea.
I'm happy to be here, CL. Thanks for inviting me.
Of course. Okay, so on to the giveaway announcements. We have multiple copies of Derek Kidner's The Message of Hosea to give away. One participant is also going to receive a stack of related resources. First on that stack, in the Gospel According to the Old Testament series done by P&R, their book on Hosea is called Love, Divine, and Unfailing. Next up, we have The Prophet and His Message by Michael J. Williams. This is going to be just a primer on how to read the prophetical literature. This one's Reading the Old Testament Prophecy Today. Next up, we have Dr. Paul O. Palmer Robertson's book, The Christ and the Prophets, or excuse me, The Christ of the Prophets. Next up, in the Mentor Commentary series, we have John McKay's book on Hosea. And then we have Zondervan's survey material, The Message of the Prophets. This is a survey of the prophetic and apocalyptic books of the Old Testament. This is, I believe, the general editor is Daniel Hayes. Last but not least is Jerry Huang's Zondervan Exegetical Commentary on the Old Testament, his book on Hosea. To enter this giveaway, just say hello in the chat. As always, we leave the last half hour for participant questions. If you would like to ask our contributors a question, please use the Q&A feature next to the chat icon. Once you've clicked the Q&A icon, just type in your question and click send. If you don't see a Q&A icon, don't worry. Just throw your question in the chat, and I'll be sure to get that to Dr. Duncan. Before we get started, let's ask the Lord's blessings. Please pray with me. Father, I thank you for all of the Bible. Every word has been breathed out by you that we might know you and your way of redemption through Jesus. As we open up the book of Hosea today, remind us that you have loved when we have not loved, that you have been faithful when we are not faithful. Show us today through your prophet Hosea to what extent you're willing to go for your people, Lord, and impress upon us anew that you've demonstrated your love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. It's in his matchless name I pray. Amen. Dr. Duncan, over to you, sir.
Thank you, CL. Thanks for all you do to set these up. And thank you, Miles, for being willing to talk to us about the wonderful little book of Hosea. Miles, start us off today just giving us a little bit of historical and canonical context for the book of Hosea.
Okay. First, I want to say I'm not necessarily an expert in the book of Hosea. I've not written a commentary or a book on it or even a journal article. So what I know from it is just general from my studies or teaching a course on the prophet. So it's just one of many, many books that I've had to cover. So I'm not going to know all of the details of every tricky verse that someone's going to ask me in the second half hour. That's just my disclaimer about that. But in general, I think I can help steer us in the right direction. In terms of historical context, Hosea is one of the earlier prophets, starting in about 750 BC, and he's a northern prophet. So he's from what might be called Samaria or Ephraim or Israel in the book. Those are three different names for the north. So his ministry ran from about 750 to 730 BC, right before the fall of Samaria or the northern tribes of Israel, and 722 to Assyria. So during Hosea's ministry, Tiglath-Pileser from Assyria would have been harassing, conquering, and deporting different sectors of the 10 northern tribes until finally in 722 BC, they're completely destroyed. So Hosea is someone who is bringing the call to judgment forward, that Israel is about to be judged for their idolatry, especially the 10 northern tribes. In terms of its canonical position, this is kind of a funny thing to say, but Hosea is not necessarily a book of the Bible. It's part of a book of the Bible. In Hebrew, there are four of latter prophets: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the book of the 12. And Hosea kicks off the book of the 12. He's the first prophet in that series, and it's the largest corpus of prophetic literature it's the largest section in that corpus. And so Hosea is at the beginning of it. And those prophets, those writing prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12, are basically Yahweh's prosecuting attorneys against Israel, indicting Israel for their sin and their breach of the Mosaic covenant. So that's kind of the context that we're in historically and theologically.
That's great. I remember, just to true confessions, many years ago, a young couple came to me and asked me to do their wedding. That's always a happy thing to do. And I often ask young couples, is there a particular scripture passage that you'd like me to use in the sermon for the wedding? And this young couple came back to me, and they had chosen a passage out of Hosea. Now, this presented two immediate problems to me, Miles. Number one, the young woman in this couple was like one of the godliest women I've ever known in my life. And I thought, if I do something in this wedding from Hosea, everybody is going to wonder, what did she do? What did she do? And then I thought, and then a lot of people are like, you pastor, you idiot, why are you using Hosea for a wedding? But so I said, look, I will do it on one condition. One is I want to give testimony to the wife's character, and number two, I want to explain why they wanted to use that particular passage. So Hosea can be tricky because of the way that the story of Israel's infidelity is told through the story of Hosea. So walk us through that message, Miles, so that we've got in our minds, not all of us have read Hosea recently, and maybe not all of us have preached through Hosea. So just walk us through the message of Hosea in a nutshell.
So the message is basically this. Israel has been unfaithful to the Lord in not upholding or keeping the terms of the Mosaic or the Sinai covenant. And this unfaithfulness is depicted as idolatry and prostitution or whoredom, that God will punish Israel for their sins, but that also he will restore them by purchasing them out of their whoredom. And so that's basically the message, that Israel is guilty, God is going to judge, but then he's going to return and redeem. And so if you're reading the prophet, you're going to be asking the question, is God going to judge them, or is God going to save them? And the answer is yes, that both are going to happen in the context of this book, and they're going to be judged, and then God is somehow in the prophets later going to redeem or restore his people by purchasing them out of that whoredom.
That's good. So help us with the structure of the book. I actually pulled up an old outline of mine, and I mean really old, like 35 years ago, I outlined the book of Hosea. So I'm really wanting to see if my outline lines up with yours, Miles, because otherwise I'm just going to scrap my outline. So walk us through the structure of the book a little bit so that we've got a feel of the flow.
Yeah. So whenever I'm teaching these courses, I always give my students the simplest possible outline.
Yeah.
So that if they're asked on the floor of presbytery to outline a book, how would they accomplish that with success? And so my outline for Hosea, and so maybe Ligon, you can help us fill this in. My outline for Hosea just has two parts. Hosea 1-3, which would be Israel's infidelity as whoredom.
Okay, that makes me happy so far. I'm 1 for 1 with you, Miles.
and then the remaining 11 chapters, so 4-14, are basically rehearsing that particular theme over and over again. From beginning to end, in terms of how the nations will relate to them, in terms of how God will relate to them in judgment, how God will turn and relate to them in salvation, etc. So I just have 1-3 Israel's infidelity characterized as whoredom or prostitution, and 4-14 that thing worked out.
That's good. And let me say, that's a great outline for an ordination exam, or for, when people are trying to figure out, do you have the contents of the Bible books in your mind and in your heart. I broke it down into 4 parts, but what I did is I did the 1-3 just like you did, and then I just broke down that second part into subgroups. Like 4-10, I have Yahweh's case against Israel and Ephraim, and then that comes in. There's subparts there, and then I have 11-13. Yahweh's long suffering with his disobedient people. And then chapter 14, Yahweh's final call to repentance. But I'm following the same kind of thing that you're doing there. Yeah.
That's great. I would endorse the exact same structure.
Well, it's, when you're outlining books, there's always more than one right way to do it. And I do think it's always good to have an outline that you can remember, and then your own familiarity with the book, you can fill in the details, if somebody asks further questions about that. Okay. So give us a few pointers. It might not just be about Hosea, but prophetic literature in general. As preachers, what do we need to be thinking about when we're getting ready to dive into that prophetic literature?
Okay, here's what I'll say. Number one, all of the so-called writing prophets, or the latter prophets, however you want to characterize them, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12, are servants of Yahweh in a particular form and fashion. They are all, I want you to think of them as prosecuting attorneys, that they are suing Israel for infidelity. And Exodus through Deuteronomy is the law upon which that lawsuit is based. And then Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, the former prophets, represent the evidence of the Lord's faithfulness to his promises and Israel's infidelity to the covenant. So you really have to understand the role of the covenant books, Exodus to Deuteronomy. The role of the former prophets Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings is a testimony to Yahweh's faithfulness. And then the specific role of these 15 prophets, or these 4 books, representing God's legal suit against Israel for their disobedience. The second thing I would say is that all of these latter prophets are using Deuteronomy 32 as their background or basis for the preaching and teaching. You could think, Isaiah to Malachi is basically a series of sermons based on Deuteronomy 32, which we call the Song of Moses, but better probably the Song of Yahweh, which was it's the song of witness against Israel before they enter into the promised land, that they will be unfaithful, that Yahweh will judge them for their infidelity. He will exile them from the land, and then he will eventually atone for his people and his land at the very end. And so you've got to know that kind of that basic structure of events to understand what the prophets are talking about. I often say, if you were to X-ray the writing prophets, you would see the spinal cord that runs through them is Deuteronomy 32.
Yeah.
In fact, the opening line of Deuteronomy 32 is, "Hear, O heavens, give ear, O earth."
Yeah.
And Isaiah 1:2 repeats the very same thing after the historical superscription, "Give ear, O heavens, and hear, O earth," as he calls to witness and invokes the covenant lawsuit text of Deuteronomy 32.
So good.
I
Yeah,
also say the
if
last.
I interrupt you for a second to just say to younger pastors there, let me speak as an old guy. I wish I had paid more attention to Deuteronomy earlier in my exposition of the Old Testament, because Deuteronomy tells you the whole story before it ever happens.
It does.
And I have preached through Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. I've not preached through Deuteronomy. Now, if I'd stayed longer at First Pres, I would have gotten there. But I've only probably in the last 10 or 15 years, Miles, realized how important Deuteronomy is to the whole Old Testament and then to the New Testament. I mean, you can't understand what Jesus and Paul are saying to the Jewish people of their day if you don't understand their interpretation of Deuteronomy via the prophets. And that Jesus and Paul are both taking the prophetic stance, the same prophetic stance against the Jewish people of their day that the Jewish prophets were taking in the Old Testament. So that's a shout out for Deuteronomy. That's a book that even if you're not preaching through it, guys, give some attention to Deuteronomy. It'll help you with everything else you do in the Old Testament, especially in the prophetic literature. So sorry, I'm getting on my soapbox, Miles. I'm just
I'm on the soapbox with you. I mean, if you think about the Hebrew Bible, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, the former prophets, have Deuteronomy 29 to 31 as their spinal cord background. And then the latter prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12 have Deuteronomy 32. So the whole agenda for the middle part of the Hebrew Bible is set between the chapters of Genesis 20 or Deuteronomy 29 and 32. So without understanding that, you're really kind of at a loss for understanding the history of Israel and the prophetic interpretation of that history. So it's huge. The last thing I would say, Ligon, in terms of how to understand the prophets, is to be prepared to feel conflict. And I mentioned this earlier. Is Yahweh going to judge his people, or is he going to restore them? And again, I said the answer is yes. Both are coming. The same thing is true of the nations. Is Yahweh going to judge the nations, use the nations as instruments of judgments, or save the nations? And they're all true, right? It depends on from what angle you're approaching the text and where you are in Deuteronomy 32. So God is bringing his judgment, yes, but he's also going to atone for and redeem that people out of their prostitution. Just like Hosea 3, when the Lord says, "Now go buy your wife out of prostitution." This is what Jesus does for his bride.
So those are some general principles for interpreting the prophetic literature. Talk to us about the uniqueness of Hosea, either within the 12 or within the larger canon.
Okay, I'll give you basically one main point here, and in Hosea, the themes of adultery and prostitution have the highest concentration in all of Old Testament literature. The Hebrew roots for to commit adultery and to commit prostitution occur 147 times in the Hebrew Bible. 28, 20, let's see, there are 28 of those. 28 of those are in Hosea themselves.
And it's
It's
not a
like,
huge book. So
no, it's
yeah,
20%. It's 20% of all the uses, and
yeah.
it's like triple the concentration of the next largest corpus. So in terms of concentration and distribution, the one thing that Hosea is really trying to get you to see at the head of this kind of book of the 12 is that Israel's infidelity is being characterized as a woman's adultery and prostitution away from her husband, and that Yahweh is going to have to divorce his wife because of her infidelity, but then he'll buy her back. And so, really, that theme, I mean, it's really the theme, you know, it connects in some sense because of that, it connects back to Genesis 2, then Ephesians 5, and then Revelation 19, 21, and 22, because the marriage covenant of Genesis 2 was ultimately pointing to the marriage covenant of Revelation 19, 21, and 22, because God had created his people to enter into his rest as his bride. And so this metaphor from Genesis 2 carries all the way across. And so Israel's infidelity to the covenant is like the infidelity in the context of a marriage, that kind of covenant breaking infidelity. So that's really Hosea's unique contribution among the 12 and really among in the Hebrew Bible itself.
And that is obviously meant to be super powerful in its impact on the Jewish people religiously.
Yeah.
Because there would, at a moral level, there would have been a lot of opprobrium about adultery in marital contexts, and so to call Israel spiritual adulterers, it's meant to have a huge impact on them. That's what your standing is like with God. You have the same standing of somebody who has been unfaithful to a spouse, and obviously, and that too, should have impacted the people of God to realize what they needed for that restoration to happen. They're not in a position to effect that restoration. They've got to look somewhere else for that restoration, and that'll be such a big part of what Jesus and Paul try to explain. But so it's really important. It sets up a super important theme for understanding the Gospels, for understanding the New Testament, for understanding God's the way that God goes about judgment and restoration, to understand that theme. So let's go right into that. How does the book of Hosea inform the way we read the New Testament, and how does it lead us to Christ? How does it point us to Christ?
Yeah. These are really, if you pick up on the theme of marriage and the covenant of marriage and stuff like that, it becomes quite clear. If you think of Genesis chapter 2, for example, Genesis chapter 2 begins with Sabbath rest and culminates with the creation of the woman in the marriage covenant. And humanity was created collectively to enter into God's rest, his Sabbath rest, as his bride. And so that very second chapter of the book of the Bible shows forth, our eschatological destiny. And because of Adam's sin, we lost both the rest and the marriage covenant. And so the New Testament, because of the work of Jesus, is restoring that to us. He's providing for us rest in himself, and he's buying us out of our prostitution or whoredom to make us his own. I like what Paul says in 2 Corinthians 11:2 when he says about the Corinthians, I feel a divine jealousy for you since I betrothed you to one husband to present you, this Corinthian people, as a pure virgin to Christ. So Paul's ministry is to take this very difficult group of people in Corinthians and to present them as a pure virgin to Christ. And really, that's the wonderful message and the hope of Hosea, that when he buys us out of our prostitution, he just doesn't keep us as like ragtag prostitutes who are always, in some sense, guilty of our sin, but changes us completely into the pure virgin that we were destined to be. And so, and that, which would make sense, with Ephesians 5:31, when Paul talks about the marriage covenant of Genesis 2 relating to Christ and the church. And then you can see in Revelation 19:21 and 22, our depiction of the collective bride, being restored into Christ in the new
That's so
creation.
good. That's so good. Okay,
So it's a wonderful
go
picture.
ahead. Go ahead.
I just saying it's a wonderful picture.
Yeah. So one more general question, because I'm already CL's already sending me questions from the audience today, and they're good ones. So I want to get right to them. But here's one more general. How does it help us teach the Christian life?
Yeah, well, I think, of course, with any passage of scripture, any book, there's a primary message and a myriad of applications. And so, in terms of applications or for Christian living, one especially too is that when Christ does redeem you, He restores you, and so that we have access now to the throne of grace as the pure virgin, not as the dirty prostitute.
Yeah.
And so I think, and so it creates in us uh, the gratitude of gospel grace to approach the throne of grace with confidence, because we've been purchased out of our former state, not just given a second chance, but actually purchased out of. And so that's a significant different thing. The book of Hosea also teaches us about our proclivity to be unfaithful, right? In fact, when God commands Hosea to take a wife of prostitution or whatever, we'll probably discuss that in the next 30 minutes.
Yeah.
I remember what Doug Stewart once said in his class 30 years ago, is that could have been any Israelite woman at the time, because all of Israel was whoring after the gods of the nations. And so it wouldn't necessarily have been a woman, specifically a prostitute at the time, but it could have been any Israelite woman. And Hosea could have been a man of harlotries, or a
Yeah.
man of whoredom,
Yeah.
because he was an Israelite at the time. And so it does teach us about the proclivity of the human heart,
Yeah.
and the need to be purchased out of that. And so in terms of the Christian living, it's our great confidence in faith that we have been indeed created
So good.
into a new virgin bride.
That reminds me a little bit of a famous Harvey Kahn story. He worked amongst prostitutes in Korea, and they had an enormous difficulty believing that God could ever love them or forgive them or restore them. And what Harvey did is he emphasized the doctrine of predestination, and which is illustrated in Hosea choosing this woman. I mean, he deliberately chooses this woman. And what Kahn would say is, God chose you deliberately before the foundation of the world. Who are you to argue with God's choosing? And in that sort of hierarchical confusion culture, they said, well, I mean, if God did it, I guess that He has the right to do that, and therefore I can be forgiven and restored. It was awesome, but that is definitely illustrated in the story of Hosea, and certainly in the New Testament.
100%.
Yeah. Okay, that's great, Miles. Thank you so much for walking us through those general questions. Let me get to the questions from the folks that are on the call with us, and you anticipated the first one already, so you've already started sort of grappling with it. And I remember this one being asked in class in seminary. So this is a good question to ask. How can the Lord tell Hosea to take a wife from whoredom, which appears to be in conflict with His instruction throughout the Bible to avoid adultery?
Yeah. So I'm going to give you two different answers, and you can choose whichever one you're most comfortable with. The first is that the expression there, a wife of whoredom, does not mean that it's not the same term as the word for a prostitute. It's based on the root, but the specific form that's used in the text is actually an abstract plural noun. And so a wife of whoredom, or a wife of prostitution-ness, something like that. And of course, this is the state of all of Israel at that time. And so it's not necessarily that God is commanding Hosea to marry a current prostitute, but all of Israel is an adulterous, prostituting people right now. And so any woman would have sufficed at this particular point. That's one. That's kind of the Doug Stewart answer, who's written a pretty substantial commentary on this and has done a lot of work there. The other one, surprise, surprise, is from Meredith Kline. And if you read his work on intrusion in the Decalogue, is that he will note that there are times when God pauses his mode of operation during the period of common grace, and at times he'll enter into periods where he employs kind of the theocratic or eschatological principle of judgment. And so, for example, the flood or the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, or even positively miracles in the Old Testament, would be the suspending of common grace and the intrusion of kind of an eschatological theocratic ethics. Okay.
Mm.
And so, in the same way, God could have commanded to do with Hosea the exact same thing that he was about to do with Israel, right? I mean, even when God chose Abraham out of Ur of the Chaldees, that guy was an idolater,
That's true.
right? He was already
Yeah.
a prostitute, you could say, or an
Joshua
adulterer.
will stress that to them, even as they're getting ready to enter in the promised land. Your fathers worshipped other gods.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
And they still were themselves, right? And they said, put away
Yeah.
the gods, get all the gods out of your tents that you're hiding and that I know about.
Yeah.
And so those are the two. So the two are that the nature of the designation is kind of like at the beginning, like any woman will do at this point because all of Israel is whoring after the gods, or that God has suspended the normal ethics of common grace to enter into kind of an eschatological intrusion.
Yeah.
And so I think both answers probably work.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, and I the only other thing I'd throw out is, one, you do have special revelation from God to Hosea telling him to do something.
Yeah,
we all know, you don't have to read your Bible very much to realize there are times when it is clear that the decretal will of God is different from the revealed will of God.
Yeah.
The most wicked act ever committed in the history of humanity is the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, and we know that was decreed by God. So it shouldn't surprise us in this case. There was such a desperate need for Israel to realize their spiritual condition before God, that desperate times create desperate measures. So, Miles is right. There are different ways you can go on this. And that's a great question, though. Good.
Yeah.
I'm not surprised somebody asked it.
Yeah, just a text to back up your statement, Ligon, would also be Genesis 22 and the sacrifice of Isaac. Right? Strictly forbidden, strictly against the revealed will of God, but decreed at that point. Yeah. An intrusion of a different ethic.
Yeah. Okay, here's another one from our conversation partners on the call. What are some of the key passages in Hosea that the New Testament picks up, and how are these passages used in the New Testament?
Okay, I've anticipated that question, and I'm scrolling to my answer right now. So, gang, there are at least 6 quotes from Hosea in the New Testament. 6 of them. Hosea 1:10 and Hosea 2:23 are combined in Romans 9:25-26 to show how God will change not my people into my people. So if you remember, that's one of the names of Isaiah's children, Jezreel, lo ruchama, no compassion, and lo ami, not my people. And really that not my people thing is a reflection on the covenant formula. I will be your God, you'll be my people, and I will dwell in your midst. And what God is saying is, I'm reversing that now, that you'll be not my people. And so Paul's picking up on that in Romans 9. Also in 1 Corinthians 15:55, some have argued that Hosea 13:14 plays out there. There are 3 quotes in the Gospels with Jesus' departure from Egypt. Out of Egypt I've called my son. Matthew 2:15, Mark 9:13, and stuff like that, quoting Hosea 6:6. So that kind of prophetic sense of God calling. So Jesus is that next Exodus event. And there's also some thought that perhaps 1 Corinthians 15:3, when Paul says that Christ died according to the scriptures, he might be referring to Hosea 6:2, where he says, after 2 days he will revive us, and on the 3rd day he will raise us up. And so there are some of that. But those are the quotations, but also just many allusions into being made the people of God.
The
whole bride of Christ kind of themes. So it's not just the quotations, but it's also the whole sense of the metaphors and the types that are being carried over.
And by the way, when I was outlining the Bible as a graduate student, again, just for my own edification, so I had a better grasp of the content of the Bible, one of the things I sort of did is make a list of verses in each Bible book that I thought were particularly important for the argument or the message. And you'll be happy to note that one of the ones that I wrote down for Hosea was Hosea 1, 9, and 10. And the
Yeah.
Lord said, call his name not my people, for you are not my people, and I am not your God. Yet the number of the children of Israel shall be like the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured or numbered. And in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, it shall be said to them, children of the living God.
Yeah.
So it's that wonderful message. And you're right, the New Testament is big time picking up on that.
In fact, like in that text in Hosea 1:9 is quite provocative because it says, call his name not my people, for you are not my people. And then the last line, when we normally translate, I am not your God, it really says, and I am not Ehyeh for you. And it's referencing right back to Exodus 3, that the name revealed
Wow.
to Moses in Exodus 3. So that covenant name is being removed from God's people in Hosea 1:9. It's a very strong statement.
Wow. Wow. What do you think is here's a third question. What's the biggest misunderstanding or error of interpretation that you see happen with the book of Hosea? It could be a pastoral standpoint that people take or a popular misunderstanding. What do you see as a big misunderstanding or misstep in interpreting Hosea?
Oh, that's a great question because I've never heard the book. I've never heard the book preached through like you're saying, Ligon,
Wow.
and I've never heard
Wow.
it taught through. So I haven't been around a lot of people. I haven't been around a lot of people who've had the chance to misapply it. But what I would probably suggest is that in the first three chapters, God is calling Hosea a prophet to do something that's unique and pertaining just to his time and calling, and that it's not necessarily something that we should be repeating or thinking about. Like, since Hosea did this, I can do that kind of thing. I think
Right.
that would be the easiest type
Right.
of misapplication. I also think too, you can misapply the kind of the corporate infidelity of Israel in terms of your own life. You can personalize it too much and not be thinking about God's people as a whole and the church as a whole, as opposed to the individual, since it's a book that really does focus on the nation of Israel and Judah. I mean, Judah is mentioned in the book 15 times too. So it's not just anti-northern. I mean, God is coming into judgment against both for their infidelity, but Israel first.
Mm.
And so probably those two things would be the biggest cautions I would give to people. But you might have experienced more
No,
in
that's good. I think that's good. You definitely have starting in the 1960s and 70s with the Jesus movement, you have some tendencies out there in the evangelical world to sort of do imitative ethics. And
yes,
the idea is, man, you got this godly, consecrated young guy, and I'm going to go find a woman on the street and marry
yeah,
her, because that's what Hosea did. So,
yeah,
yeah, thankfully, I've never seen that. I hadn't had that issue come up in pastoral ministry, but it is just a general reminder that just because it happens in the Old Testament or in the New Testament doesn't mean that you copy it.
yeah.
So that's a timely word. Okay, here's another one. It would seem that God's strongest, harshest, most shocking language throughout the scripture is used to describe his own people's idolatry. Why is this the case?
Because they were his treasured possession, his wife, his dearest treasure, and 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 think about they were possessors of the covenants, and they knew his law, and they had heard his voice from Sinai, and in the midst of all of that, they still committed adultery. And so, when Jesus says, you know, you believe because you see, but blessed are those who believe when they don't see, right? And so I think, I think that Israel, with all of their privileges, grieved, grieved God in their sin because he had cherished them so. And so I think the language is appropriate. If something like that happened to me in my own life, I could think if any old woman mistreated me, that's fine. I'm not really concerned about that. But my wife mistreated me, that would be much more grievous to me and much more hurtful and painful and require a different
It's
kind
more
of different.
precious. Yeah,
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 that's because she's
yeah,
more precious. So I
yeah,
think it's the precious nature of the relationship that
yeah.
warrants or provokes that language.
And of course, the whole metaphor points to the exclusivity that is meant for the
Yeah.
relationship between us and God. And I follow a person on Instagram who's an expert. She's a counselor and she's an expert in affairs, and she talks about what affairs do to people
Mm,
and how they split them in two.
mm.
And it's so interesting that a lot of the, and I don't even know whether she's a Christian or not, she's just really sharp in understanding these things, but a lot of the things apply exactly to the situation you're talking about here, Miles. So
Mm.
okay, here's another one. How do you affirm the confession statement that God has no parts or passions, and it's an affirmation of impassibility, and yet utilize this very powerful emotional language in contexts like Hosea with love and marital fidelity and whoredom and bringing a
Hmm.
lawsuit and all of that? How does that work, Miles?
Well, Ligon, I'm probably going to need your help on this one, which is it's why I work on a team. But I'd say this: I just, when I think about the incarnate Christ and I think about his weeping and his anger,
Yeah,
weeping over the death of Lazarus,
yeah,
angry in the temple,
yeah,
rejoicing before the Lord, grieving his own death. I don't think I think all of all of our all of that corresponds to humanity is image of God correspondence,
yeah,
right? And so I don't think it violates any of the confessional stances on God's simplicity or
yeah.
impassibility.
And I think, and here's where you'll have to help me, linguistically. So often in Hebrew, the anthropopathic language, the language of human emotion ascribed to God, is actually rooted in anthropomorphic language. So when it may
Yes.
say, God got angry, it actually means his face got red.
Right. Yeah.
And so that's rooted in the way good Orthodox Hebrew theologians wrote about God. So we're not making something up there. Now,
Right.
nor do you have to deny the doctrine of impassibility to affirm those realities. Obviously, number one, as Miles has said, Jesus is a model for you. And by the way, compassion is the thing that is predicated of him more than anything else
Yeah.
in the Gospels with regard to emotional life. And we don't in any way need to dial down that in order to affirm the importance of impassibility. One of the importances of impassibility, of course, is just to say we don't have a God whose emotional life fluctuates like ours do.
Right.
Sometimes our emotional life can incapacitate us, and God is never incapacitated, but he is also maximally loving and compassionate towards his people all the time, and invariably loving and compassionate towards these people, and that we should rejoice in that. So
Yeah.
we're not denying the reality of divine affections. We're just saying they don't operate the same way. Human affections are so often triggered by another person. Another
Yeah.
person punches you in the nose and you get mad, or another person is kind to you and it evokes a particular response. One of the things that we're saying when we say that God is impassible is that he is generative of his own affective state. That's
Mm.
not brought about outside of him. It's actually wells up from within him. And so his love
Yeah.
is the overflow of his self towards us. It's not evoked by
Sure.
us towards him. But that's in no way should we dial down the really strong language that you see in Moses and in the prophets about God's the emotional state of God. Very often in Hebrew writing is there to let you know God's moral assessment of something. So if
Yeah.
if Moses talks about God being angry, he's saying, well, just like you see your mom and your dad get angry when you do something wrong, God doesn't want you to do that wrong thing. That's his moral assessment of that, is that seriously wrong. And so it again accentuates the very point that Miles has been talking about, is the main point of the passage. No wife would be indifferent about a husband that she loved being unfaithful to her. She would be angry about that. And she would have, I remember, I remember a woman coming to Doug Kelly's office at the old campus, and she was really struggling with anger. And she felt very guilty about it. And she talked with Dr. Kelly, and she was struggling with anger because her husband had been unfaithful to her. And Dr. Kelly just looked at her and said, "Ma'am, you ought to be mad. You have every right to be mad about that. That's the appropriate thing for you to be." And so the God's assessment of Israel's infidelity is appropriate. It's what it ought to be.
That's good.
I've gotten more questions, Miles. Let me keep throwing them at you. How should we understand God making a covenant with beasts and birds in Hosea 2:18? How do you roll? Is that Noachic? Is that Edenic? Or is that new covenant consummation? Or how would you work that out, Miles?
Yeah, well, man, it's a tricky question. There are a lot of different ways to work this out, depending on how you view the unfolding of creation in Genesis chapter 1 and 2. My own particular view is that God created the world covenantally. And you can see that because he does everything by division in the first 3 days. And that's a covenantal act. And even the creation of the woman is done by division from the man, so it's covenantal. And we know that, for example, in Genesis chapter 9, that God is in covenant with all of humanity and all of the world, even the terrestrial globe and all of the animals that live in it. We know that God is in covenant with the sun, the moon, and the stars from the book of Jeremiah. And so he runs and rules the world, both the visible and the invisible realms, covenantally. And it's not just his people, but the world itself. And so all of life is in covenant with God. That's how he condescends and relates to us. So I don't think there's any kind of problem with that kind of language, especially with antecedents back in Genesis chapter 9, which actually is making reference back to Genesis chapter 3, where God instituted common grace.
That's good. Okay, here's a sort of a pastoral question. Do you have suggestions? You're talking to a congregation, you have men and women sitting out there in front of you, and they're going to relate to this material a little bit differently. How do you talk about the idea of whoredom in Hosea without targeting just women? And I think you've already hinted at this when you were explaining Doug Stewart's take on this. But how do we get it so that we don't, identify the men with Hosea and the women with Gomer?
That's good.
We all get involved in this thing.
Yeah, it's we are all sons of God. We're all brides of Christ. And so the metaphor works in a number of different ways. And the church collective, or God's people, were conceived of as his bride. And so here, God is the faithful husband, Israel is the unfaithful spouse, and that Israel contains male and female members. It just happens to be the working of the analogy or the metaphor here, where God is portrayed as the male figure and Israel as the female figure. But it certainly doesn't have to be that way. A man can just as easily be unfaithful and commit whoredom and all that kind of business. And so it's just making sure that you appropriately apply that to everybody without saying generically women are more likely to be unfaithful, because that's the way Hosea and Gomer are played out. That's entirely wrong.
Yeah, that's good. And so that goes back to the base message of the book, which the problem is with the whole people of God being unfaithful, not the women being unfaithful. Even though in this case, Hosea sort of stands in as the representative of God. Himself, as you said, he's part of a, I dwell among a people of unclean lips. I'm a man of unclean lips. It's sort of Isaiah applied to Hosea there. Okay, here's another one. How can we teach well and correctly the wrestling that God has between "I will punish you" and "how can I punish you" in Hosea 11:8 and 9?
Yeah. I think it's this, I think it's the same thing that we've been talking about, that built into the covenant law. So let's say if all these prophets are rooted back in Deuteronomy 32, Deuteronomy 32 is formally and literarily a covenant lawsuit text. It has all the, witnesses, indictments, curses. But a guy named G. Ernest Wright, who was a Harvard professor from the 1950s and 60s, called this a broken lawsuit because halfway through, after the Lord has executed his lawsuit, he relents and says, but. And it's that big but that changes everything. I'm going to come
Yeah.
back and save you and redeem you and buy you out and restore you. And if you read the last few verses of the song of Moses or Yahweh, in like verses 39 to 43 or 40 to 43, I am Yahweh and there is no other. I'm going to I'm going to take vengeance on my enemies, save my people, atone for my people, my land. And so there's this, the Lord would rather have his people repent and return than face judgment. And so that's his heart. I mean, God reveals the nature of his heart in Exodus 32 to 34 when he hides Moses in the rock and proclaims his name, slow to anger, compassionate, abounding in steadfast love, forgiving iniquities to thousands, that kind of thing. And so that's what's going on there, is that God is showing us that he's not a vindictive and he's not quick to anger, that he longs for people to repent and be restored unto him.
So
So
good.
there is that like I said, there is that conflict in the prophets between God saying he's going to judge his people and redeem and restore his people.
Now, this one's slightly off topic. Miles, would you have a suggestion on how a person could start a self-study of biblical Hebrew?
Uh, oh boy, yeah, yes. But I'll just say that's so hard because Hebrews, um, RTS Global has the materials and the resources for you to study Hebrew on your own, and you can do it on your own pace at your own time, that kind of business. So I think that that you can do it. You can
You've
also,
also got a course of study from Zondervan, right? There's Zondervan.
I've also got video lectures and all the
Yeah.
Hebrew resources you could ever want. Um, but I would say to whoever's asking that question, there are more opportunities now available to you than just self-study, especially like with the Zoom classes and
Yeah.
remote live classes and stuff like that. Like every other year, I've taught Hebrew one day a week over the course of the year on one afternoon a week. And you get help. And so I think self-study is a hard thing for Hebrew, like learning that
Yeah.
alphabet and the vowels. I would at least take Hebrew 1 with someone to get some
Yep.
help, and then
And
just keep going from there.
if I can just testify, I have seen over the last number of years, ever since you started the Summer Institute of Biblical Languages, pastors that will set aside 6 weeks
Yeah.
and show up and be in classroom with you and go from reading zero Hebrew to being able to read their Hebrew Bible in 6 weeks.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I've just seen it happen over and over. We've had people come from outside the country,
Yeah. China,
and just spend
Moldova,
6 weeks.
Honduras.
Yep.
Yeah.
And Miles can take
Scotland.
you from zero to Hebrew in 6 weeks, and it's amazing. And but I love how your students work together. They
Yeah.
rarely are they just working on their own. They're usually helping one another, encouraging one another, studying together, doing vocabulary with one another, trying to memorize, various grammatical rules and principles together. I think that the team approach definitely helps.
Yeah. I agree. I agree. And the nice thing is now, even with Zoom, like I encourage my students, one of the difficult things of pastoral ministry is being alone and isolated at your pulpit, wherever you are in the country or the world. And I tell my students, now you don't have to be. You can still keep up with your, fellow students or colleagues through Zoom, and you can meet once a week and do Hebrew together. So I've got several pairs of students who meet and do Hebrew together weekly through Zoom, stuff like that.
In connection with that question, another question just popped in. On the note of Hebrew and Greek, what accordance package would you recommend to a busy, poor pastor?
Yeah, I forget what it's the very base model, that has Hebrew and Greek involved in it. And if you're an RTS alum, you get a very good discount on that. And then I mean, I was the same way. I started buying it probably 30 years ago. And I just, I was so poor as a student. I just bought what I could. And then every year I would just try to add something to it. And so it really does help. The language resources on Accordance can be very helpful tools.
Okay, to Hosea.
Okay.
What is an example in Scripture where God gives an example of Israel's unfaithfulness, where a man is the main character or actor? That might help diffuse a congregation's response to the way that the book talks about Gomer. Do you have any suggestions?
Solomon.
Mm, yep.
So First Kings
Yep.
11. First, if you read the kingship laws from Deuteronomy,
Yep.
and then you read the assessment of Solomon's kingship in those categories, he's a bad dude. And
Yep.
it basically says at the end of that in First Kings 11, and he did that which was evil in the eyes of the
Yep.
Lord, and his wives turned his heart away from the Lord. And that expression, he did that which was evil, is a direct quote out of the book of Judges
Mm,
for Israel's apostasy.
mm.
And so, I mean, that's really laying down,
That's
the
good.
heat
That's really good,
against
Miles.
what we would consider a kind of one of the heroes of the Old Testament in terms of temple building.
That's super helpful. Well, Miles, this has been so edifying. I appreciate you taking time to work through the book with us. I've had a number of people write in the last time you talked with us, and found it so helpful. I think this will be helpful if anybody's getting ready for a sermon series in Hebrew in Hosea. This is a great place to start.
Yeah.
Maybe you could end with this. Do you have any favorite commentaries? I mean, I know we mentioned the Kidner commentary, and I always say Kidner's always good. Do you have favorite commentaries that you like to use on Hosea?
So I've used Kidner's commentary, and I think that's probably the one I'd recommend. But I also use Doug Stewart's commentary on Hosea through Obadiah, Hosea through Obadiah, something like that. Just because it's so good technically and historically, and he doesn't miss anything. And so Kidner's good for kind of the message and the theology, and Stewart's good for the nuts and bolts, I think.
Right.
Not that they're either neglect
Yeah.
one, but each commentary has its own purpose and stuff like
Right.
that. But I always say, 1 or 2 hours in the Hebrew text is worth 6 or 7 hours in a commentary.
There you go.
And so use the commentaries as tools, not crutches, and start with the Hebrew text if you can, and the Lord will help you. There's also, I think, Crossway has those books like 12 weeks through something, and I've done like the one on Judges. There's probably one on Hosea that will be helpful. I trust that series as well.
It's really good. CL, thanks so much for organizing this for us, and it's back to you, my friend.
Yeah, thanks so much. I learned a lot today. Thank you, Miles. Thank you, Dr. Duncan. We appreciate y'all. Well, let me announce our next online discussion forum for November 12th. Again, that's a Tuesday, 12 o'clock CST. We're going to have Megan Hill and Dr. Duncan back with us. We're going to be discussing Megan Hill's book, Sighing on Sunday. This is 40 meditations for when church hurts. I think we all realize when we come to Christ, we come to the church as well, and we're a part of a body, and that body is very much still sinful. And so Megan is addressing that aspect of things, and we look forward to hearing from her, and just know that one day the church will be perfected in glory, and we will no longer sin against one another. So please come and hear more from Megan. Thanks so much again, guys.